I am NetMoverSitan. Welcome to the Canard section of the Lore series. Any guests and abnormalities that appear here will be covered in this. This is basically where the library starts gathering books from the guests invited. But the first question is, what is a canard? Yes, that is a good question. A canard is an unfounded rumor or story. In this case, it's more likely something that others don't want to admit exists, as it implies that there's worse situations than what they already have. Don't believe me? You will by the time we're finished with this lore breakdown. Or better yet, please review my Lobotomy Corporation lore series. Let's start with the rats. The desperate denizens of the backstreets, the nastier parts of each district, those barely surviving, in parts of the city where some are forced to eat actual rats and even other humans just to stay alive. The rats sometimes harvest organs to sell on to those willing to pay them. A lone individual without any form of special power or equipment won't last long in the backstreets, even if they're a fixer. That's why a few group together. Those that do stand a better chance of surviving the backstreets. These are the rats, gangs that group together purely out of necessity and mutual survival. They look understandably as shabby as their weapons, certainly in the case of this trio of rats that accept the invite to the library. Pete, Lenny, and Mung Chi. Let's start with the gruff and foul-mouthed leader of this group of rats, Pete. He has high ambitions, aiming to become one of the Fingers, as in one of the most powerful and most ruthless of the organized crime syndicates. That's quite an achievement in the backstreets. Armed with an army knife, he's more than willing to gamble with his life in order to advance his syndicate, which barely qualifies as such. Chasing any rumors that could lead to something good. He's also quite perceptive and has no delusions regarding how crazy the backstreets are, along with how crazy that world is in general. Too many chasing dreams that will never come true. As for the idea of going legit, such as trying to enter a wing or a fixer office, he'd likely say something along the lines of, "No, shove that up your ugly. There'd be a ski resort in hell before I do either of those." Now, what about the other two? Let's move on to Lenny. She's the surgeon, or at least one that deals with organ harvesting. She's capable of keeping herself under control compared to the others. She uses a rusty scalpel in battle, which will be more likely to kill by stabbing them, rather than infecting them with tetanus. She had a dream once, which involved trying to get into an examinee town in order to study for wing entrance exams, which is one way to get into one of the wings of the world. This was clearly before Lobotomy Corporation's lower recruitment standards, where all you had to have to be suitable was the ability to feel physical and emotional pain. That which, according to the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, is what gives life meaning. Certainly with that wing. Either that or she saw a scam in it. Well, it wouldn't be off by much, considering what happened there. Most fail with trying to get into an examinee town. Zenny was one of them. She gave up on dreams since then, as if she had what it took. Well, if she did have what it took, she wouldn't be in the backstreets in the first place, and although she keeps it to herself, she thinks that Pete is a huge idiot for having dreams. Finally, we have Meng Chi. He's the helper. Although he's nervous in speech, he wields a small hammer in battle. Quite fitting, as Meng Chi means hammer in Korean. According to him, there are grades for each part of the backstreets, any under the protection of any organization, whether it be a simple fixer office or an association of fixers, or an organized crime syndicate. They're higher, and therefore safe, from the sweepers. And those that have watched my Ordeals Law section, that's the one for Lobotomy Corporation, by the way, will know what they can do. Any that dress differently to others in a given backstreet are shunned by those that fit in, hinting at a tribal mentality between each district's backstreets. For example, say that you were from a backstreet that had a traditional Korean look to it, and went to another part of the backstreets where the main religion is Aussieism, where they worship the Prince of Darkness himself. They'd stand out more than a hamburger stall in the middle of a part of India with a large Hindu population that has a sign saying 100% real beef. As for those that don't pay the protection fees to a syndicate, well, those alleys unable to do that have some nasty-looking visitors coming their way. And it's not syndicate thugs. It's the sweepers that they paid the syndicates to protect them from, which led to Meng Chi's former neighbors being eaten alive by the sweepers, as if they were a bunch of Kirby clones in front of a buffet. Yeah, a whole group of pink demons, minus the cuteness and black hole stomach. We'll be getting to those, don't worry. And the most disturbing part of that is, it's not an isolated instance. Rats often hear out any strange rumours, even about other groups, whether they be legit or criminal. Well, other groups often use them to track down anything interesting or anomalous. As for where this group of rats fits into this, well, yes, let's move on to the story, as I think we've covered the main players of what barely counts as a syndicate. Well, I'd say barely counts as, well, they're not exactly well equipped, are they? I mean, a Swiss Army knife? A rusty scalpel and a hammer? What next? Being armed with a nail gun? One night, they were gut harvesting in Zwei Association territory. They didn't stick around, knowing that they didn't stand a chance against the well-armed fixers that were part of it. So they quickly got the victims' organs into a duffel bag and headed back to their hideout. Unfortunately, the organs weren't worth anything due to them being too badly damaged. Due to them somehow being damaged from within the body without any external damage. One thing that was not supposed to be there was an orange tattoo on the back of the neck. This wasn't a pressing matter, as what was pressing was their debt to the stray dog syndicate. That, and they were being hunted by the Zwei Association. So it looked like the rodents that some feast on in the backstreets stand a better chance of survival than they do. At least until they found an invitation within the victim's organs. Considering that their debt was due within the next few hours, they had nothing left to lose from accepting it. They passed through the door that magically appeared, and they found themselves in the library. Meanwhile, Roland, a washed-up former Grade 9 fixer and patron librarian of the General Works floor, and Angela, the former assistant of Lobotomy Corporation and the current director of the library, just saw the stories of the guests that were coming, moments before the invitation was found, and before they signed it. Roland was concerned that the library can just trap them and kill them easily. But Angela answers him that it's the will of the invitation and the library. All she does is borrow that power. The invitations themselves find a way to guests, and doesn't have any impact on external actions. Roland compares this to what happens in the ruins. Apparently, events happen there that could be compared to magic. And also goes over what they're about to meet to Angela before she meets them. Yeah. A desperate syndicate, that's what they're meeting. Once this group of rats enters the library, Angela makes it clear to Pete that they can take what they want if they're able to do so. As in, if they can defeat the librarians in their way. Mang-Chi asks if it's worth the risk. A bit late now, aren't you? Pete wasn't as selective as they were out of options. After their defeat and their transformation into books, Angela asks if it's important to join a syndicate. Roland answers her by saying that it's necessary to join with any group that provides strength in numbers. Well, that's at least what he was implying, as the city was tough and would show no mercy to those out in the open. That was certainly the case with those three, as they were trapped like... Let's move on to Yoon's office. Fixers come in many forms. If color fixers are the equivalent of executives of a major law firm, Yoon's office is the equivalent of a film noir private detective agency, although with more people in the employ of the operator of it. The fixers of this office are either Class 9, which are usually novices, or Class 8. They're nicer dressed than the rats are, due to them being in a slightly better position. Yoon's office accepts the jobs too menial for other fixer offices, such as finding lost cats. I'm talking about domestic cats. Nothing that's otaku bait. Nor is it some musical adaptation that bombed. Just furry creatures that some might want to put on the menu, in lieu of rodents. May whoever does that receive a chainsaw up their ass. Speaking of which, the fixers of this office, they're better equipped than the rats were. Finn is a grade 9 novice fixer with hopes to better his lot. His loyalty extends to reporting back with the invitation to the library, rather than using it himself. He's also a traditionalist, refusing modifications, which gave Yoon the impression that he was mediocre. That, and he seemed to lack raw talent. As for why Finn was a fixer, he wanted to buy a nest migration ticket for his sister to improve her life. How selfless of him. Let's hope that his sister has something to contribute. Otherwise, it wouldn't be long before she was back in the backstreets. He's certainly more an optimist than I am, wanting to see the best in others. Does he not know where he is? Anyway, he has a serrated short sword to wield against his enemies. He might be an optimist, but that doesn't mean that he's a pacifist. I mean, who ever heard of one of those in a fixer office? I certainly haven't. Next of the fixers of Yoon's office is Eri. She had recently become a grade 8 fixer, one who was overconfident and verbally puts down any that she sees as weaker. Unlike Finn, she had her body augmented. She understood that what was noticed was how much he spent on the body, much like some do in our world, whether that be customizing a vehicle or cosmetic surgery, or even clothing. She chose a procedure that gave her enough strength to use her weapon one-handed. She sees it as a necessity in these dark times. As for her weapon, she wields what could be considered a chain sword? Basically, a large chainsaw that appears to also have been modified to be used like a sword, and in our world, a standard chainsaw is difficult enough to wield with two hands. Finally, we have Yoon, the operator of this office. He's cold-hearted and cynical. Well, I can understand that second part. Although deep down, he is sympathetic to those under him, and didn't have a dislike towards Finn, even though, like the rest of his employees, he's willing to exploit him, believing that it's not a matter of if they die, but when. Based on what he knew about the city, about how cruel and unforgiving it could be. He saw Finn as uncommon with his passion, but had a low opinion of his talent, his lack of augmentation, and his choice of weapon. Finn sees him as cold, but kind enough to teach him. Yoon's attack method of choice is his fists, suitably augmented to enhance his strength, and possibly something to increase his agility, as one of the best ways to avoid damage is to, well, get out of the way of whatever's trying to cause you harm. Blocking also works, but that works better if you have some kind of weapon in your hands, rather than using your hands as a weapon. Well, they're not fully replaced, those arms, so it's not a good idea in his case. Oh, and those three aren't the only fixers in this office. It's not that small. According to the more generic fixers of Yoon's office, it's a meritocracy among their kind, where how high you climb is determined by how good you are, although they're thankful to any that would accept them. As for the definition of good, that can vary. It's not based purely on physical strength. Although that's one way of being good at the job, it can also be something like having enough intelligence. Some threats can be outsmarted, rather than be outfought. As for the backstreets themselves, they are untangled alleyways spread across the city. They're so vast that it's impossible for even the head to know everything that goes on in them. And besides, they're the least of the worries of those that live there. Both syndicates and fixers look for business, and sometimes fight each other. Yeah, there's definitely fierce competition there. As for the workshops, they're willing to sell their wares, tools, and gadgets to whoever is willing to pay them. They don't take sides in the conflicts that occur there. If you think that fixers are good guys who fight bad guys, you really do live in black and white, don't you? Sorry, can't say anything like that without laughing at how ridiculous that sounds in this context. As that they're just doing their jobs to survive until the next payday. Some clients don't seem to get the memo that they're about as common in that world as retail workers are in ours. But fixers are obligated and indeed motivated to fulfill their requests, due to how explosive they can be if they don't. And I'm not talking about in the suicide bomber way. I'm talking about in the dissatisfied customer way. A fixer office that's competent enough can be sponsored by higher organizations, such as associations, wings, or even workshops. Well, someone needs to test the weapons, I suppose. Individual fixers are most sought after, but are rarer than a passionate individual in that city. Those that start will need to purchase their own equipment with their own money, if they want to survive even the rats that prey on any lone individual unfortunate enough to not be prepared for the dangers of the backstreets. This money can be loaned to those that are accepted. These fixers see the world as one big hamster wheel. Run, little rodents! Run! And then stuff your face with seeds. And this is not including the consideration that you can't really benefit from your payday if you're dead. And as Yoon would put it, death is an ever-present threat. As for where he and the others fit into the story, well, sometime after that group of rats had it, Finn and two other fixers were looking for a lost cat in the backstreets. Finn had a stronger work ethic than those he was working with, full of optimism, and had hope of either a promotion or a better position, or even moving on to an association. Is he completely sane? Then again, he understands that they have to start somewhere. As grade 9 fixers. Finn then found an invitation to the library in his pocket. He wanted to report it to Yoon, but the fixers that he was with had other ideas, and decided to use it in order to look into it themselves. It didn't end well for them. Hard to know who it was meant for. Was it meant for Finn? Or was it meant for them to use in order to, well, if the latter was the case, then Finn was just a convenient delivery system for the invitation. When they didn't come back, Yoon and Finn discussed the library and how a door just appeared when the invitation was signed. Thankfully, Yoon was more prudent than the fixers that failed to return. He wasn't about to send fixers into the library, certainly not of his office without any clear evidence. And it was unlikely that he believed Finn. But before they could talk about anything else, an invitation appeared on Yoon's desk. The timing, funnily enough, couldn't have been better. He then told Finn to leave the room as he pulled some strings and took out a loan to hire some muscle for this. He clearly wasn't one to take chances. Finn was likely wise to go to Yoon first. Unfortunately for him, Yoon had Finn go into the library to scout it out. Although he was uneasy about it, he knew that it was likely to be certain death for what is essentially a yellow bird that's used as an early warning system. Yeah, that's right. He's a canary in a cage. This is because the contract told Yoon to confirm the situation. Well, Finn got... That's the short version. After defeating Finn, Roland mentioned finding it hard going to deal with guests by himself. After jokingly saying that Angela should help him out, she stated that even though she could defend herself, that's not her role. But there are some books that he can enter to retrieve additional librarians. To do so, he would need to defeat the abnormality within their books. Powerful beings that were weakened since they were last around, contained in environments that were perfect for them. Once he defeats them, he can utilize their power in battle whenever his emotional level increases, which would increase the books gathered from guests. With that knowledge, he entered the Book of the Bloodbath. This abnormality has a connection to the past of what is now the library. Before the facility had cruelty and suffering woven into its very fabric. Carmen was one of those in charge. She was rare among those within the Botany Corporation. She had hope, passion, and dreams. She was also at least resistant to, if not immune, to the disease of the soul, the mind, or whatever you want to call it, that she observed in most others. Unfortunately, she also broke due to Enoch, one of the children that she had taken in, dying due to being part of an experiment that had fatal consequences. It hit her hard, especially when Lisa, the other child, said that she should have died instead of Enoch. Lisa didn't mean it with herself, but when Carmen said it, she did mean it. This self-destructive behavior, born out of guilt for failing Enoch, led to her going into a filled bathtub. A filled bathtub and cutting herself in order to bleed to death. It was this strong feeling of guilt and the act of suicide that spawned this abnormality. An abnormality that normally draws in any who suffer from depression or are weak-willed, dragging them into a pool of blood that is part of it. This time, however, it's brought in the form of a humanoid monster made of blood. Now, with most of these, I'll give a brief overview of what they are. This was covered in the Object section of the Lobotomy Corporation Lore Breakdown series. Although, as previously stated, it's different this time around. Bloodbath, this time, isn't a bath filled with blood, with accessories that would be more in place with an Arab method of punishing theft. severed hands. This time it's vaguely humanoid. A vaguely humanoid blob made of blood. Bloodbath itself is filled with despair, fixated with suicide, and scars from failed attempts. Although it doesn't want to cause pain. It doesn't stop it from dragging in those that they can towards the pool of blood. As for what Roland thinks of this, well, this introduces him to the bizarre nature of abnormalities. Oh, and the abnormalities have been weakened since they were last seen. Bloodbath's stage is a large stage made of skin, with various puddles of blood, and scars, and a pair of closed eyes in the background wall, which only open under specific conditions. More specifically, if Roland were to be staggered. Which, considering he fights this solo, it's a death penalty. Upon victory, the general floor increased to level 2. A second librarian was unlocked for Roland to utilize, and the power of the bloodbath was his to wield. After that, when Yoon met up with Eri, a recently promoted grade 8 fixer, it was confirmed that he, like Eri, expected Finn's failure. Eri would miss his cutesy attitude, as she would put it. Although deep down, he felt some grief about that happening. His rationale was that well, if it wasn't that got him killed, it would have been something else. Disappearing in the backstreets and getting ripped apart are two of the milder examples. Well, he's not wrong, considering what was in Lobotomy Corporation. And it was revealed that paying the monthly taxes and rent for the office space they were using was a problem for them, making them almost as desperate as the rats were in regards to the library case. Which is why they were sending the entire office into it. And once they arrived, well, can you guess what happens? Yep. Angela greeted them and remarks on Yoon's sentimental attitude towards Finn. Ironic, considering how he used him to test the shark-infested waters, only to get eaten by them. He didn't think much of that. At least, that's what he told Angela. He saw it this way. Everyone gets exploited and abandoned at some point. Well, he's not wrong. Certainly not in that city. Angela can even speak from personal experience. The more generic fixes that he sent to soften Roland into his assistant librarian, or at least try, fell in battle. Then all that remained of his office was him and Eri. Even with their superior augmentations, it wasn't enough, and they fell also. Yoon's office was no more. The loan would be unpaid. And if there was anything that could be taken in lieu of payment in their apartments, it was unlikely to even come close to repaying the debts. Yeah, up happens. A terrible fate, isn't it? But it's completely normal for them. After that, Roland found his way onto the floor of history and overheard a heated conversation between Angela and Malcoof, the patron librarian of that floor, who couldn't forgive Angela for something that she did. Angela reminded her of their deal and to cooperate without complaint. Yeah, this was part of that deal. And she also told her to try and appreciate the fleshy body that she had been given. A fleshy body that she didn't ask for. And she still didn't agree with what Angela was doing. As for who Malcoof was, she was originally Elijah, one of the researchers that was around when all three of the founders of the Botany Corporation were either still in human bodies or still alive. She overreached herself, wanting to take part in the cogito experiments. She broke into where it was stored and tested it on herself. It killed her painfully as Ain watched her die. She was brought back as the separate Malcoof in a robot body that couldn't be confused for human, as per the head's anti-AI law, the AI Ethics Amendment. She eventually overcame her trauma and became more honest with herself regarding how good a worker she really was. She was impatient to be part of the cogito experiments. She was irresponsible with something that had potentially lethal side effects. And as for selfishness, well, one constant is her cheerful attitude, with a mix of determination and a strong work ethic. Well, can't really fault her for that, unless it's approaching Japanese levels. Yeah, that kind of work ethic can be lethal in the long term. After Angela left the floor of history, Malcoof introduced herself to Roland. He was relieved to find someone more lively. She mentioned unfinished business and that she had to follow orders regardless of her personal feelings. Much the same as it was with Roland, whom she requires to bring books that are about history, which are then read in order to make her floor whole, which would eventually awaken other patron librarians on their floors. Roland was surprised by how bright she was, considering her situation. She didn't let it get in the way of her work, and wouldn't let it get to her. Well, she had her own reasons for this. Reasons which aren't all revealed at this point. Now, those who have at least watched a run of Lobotomy Corporation, never mind played it or watched my lore breakdown series, will know that Malcoof is certainly one of the more sociable of those involved in this. Not all of them will be. I can assure you of that. Next, we have a syndicate. Now, there are those that make money and aren't too particular about the legality of the methods. That's basically what syndicates are, organized crime groups. There are some that want to do away with the pleasures of the flesh and the risk of disease, seeing them as distractions to making money. Those that want that undergo a full cybernetic replacement of their bodies, basically putting their brains in artificial bodies. Now, what does that remind me of? It's not a race of monsters that are just below wheelie bins armed with industrial egg whisks and sink plungers, in terms of threat level, that's for certain. They're also more humanoid than what I'm thinking of. This full body replacement is at least partially financed by them selling their organic bodies. Even so, it's cheap enough to do for those that can afford it, at least compared to firearms overall. Even so, this syndicate had a tight budget and could only afford low-quality parts. The syndicate known as the Brotherhood of Iron. Yeah, Brotherhood of Steel is taken. Anyone notice the similarities between them and the red fixers of the white ordeals in the Botany Corporation? Except these fixers I'm thinking of had better bodies and could also afford more effective weapons, such as a beam cannon. The black fixers are they're probably similar, except they have a different attack method in mind. Well, they certainly have a hammer. Yeah, that looks painful. Let's hope they don't appear at some point. Right, where were we? Oh yes, the Brotherhood of Iron. First we have Mo. He's the most focused of this syndicate. And if there was a leader of these monkey brains on legs, it would be him. Although he's quite particular that they maintain their bodies as best as they can, and focus on making money, so that they can afford better parts. He secretly regretted replacing his body with a cheap, artificial one, as it's more vulnerable to damage. It creaks, and is compromised on too much, such as lacking the ability to taste anything. That would be torture, wouldn't it? Remembering what it was like to touch, feel, and taste, but not experiencing any of it. Although, thanks to desire stimulation chips, medication, or a number of other methods, that can be worked around. He just wasn't patient enough to save up for a higher quality body with all the senses faithfully recreated. It's what his greed was focused on getting. He wields a large chainsword, although he doesn't have as much problems wielding it, lacking the fleshy parts that Eri of Yoon's office had. And I'm talking about muscles as in around the arms. Yeah, augmented or not, it's punishing on those, aren't they? Next we have Constar, who clearly didn't think things through when they changed their bodies, as They loved food and its taste. I say this because once they switched over to an artificial body, they couldn't taste it. So they worked towards either getting a better body or finding a way of turning that desire off. Possibly by finding that part of their brain and, I don't know, using an implant to disable it. Consta carries a chain longsword for combat. Yeah, I think we can tell the pattern with this one, don't we? Finally, we have Arnold, who tries to stay level-headed about their tasks. They're knowledgeable about body replacement technology and analyze what is being fought against. They're ambitious, as their idea for a syndicate is to make a name for themselves by raiding a fixer office. Basically, storm it and wreak havoc, which is a gamble, as they might find that their opponent is stronger than previously estimated, but it can be worth the risk sometimes, depending on the office. Then again, some raid them more out of boredom, killing those that are less able to fight back. They understand enough about misjudging the opponent could result in the skirmish being over before the first move is made. Arnold wields a chainsaw arm as a weapon. As for how they fit into what's happening, well, let's go over that then. The Brotherhood of Iron was in their hideouts. When Mo was telling them about refilling their heads regularly with brain fluid so that it didn't dull their thoughts, well, their brains needed sustaining. Then they argued what to rob. Well, Arnold suggested a workshop for components. Well, that sounds like a good idea, considering what their bodies are made of. As for Consta, they suggested an office to gain infamy. Not a wise move, unless it's vulnerable, or they have decent enough weapons. As they are talking about being distracted about making money by food. They then find an invite embedded onto Mo's shoulder. Pretty hard to miss then. They then decided that it was worth looking into, so they signed the invitation and entered the library through the door that appeared. Hard to believe that it was unnoticeable, but pain wasn't what was felt, so it's understandable. They believed that it was just a play for the rich folks for their amusement. When they arrived and observed their surroundings. If only it was that simple. There was no turning back for them from that point. So all they could do was go inside and, well, fight the librarians. As for the play of the rich folks, this is where they abduct the denizens of the backstreets and dump them in some kind of labyrinth and watch what they do. Watch how they desperately survive in there. before they ultimately die themselves. Yeah, it's sickening amusement. And you're probably asking, is entertainment really that poor in the city? Well, based on this, and other examples I haven't mentioned yet, it probably is. After they were defeated and turned into books, somehow, Roland discussed the flaws of the poorly made decision and one-way process that is replacing an organic body with a robot body. As there are more convenient alternatives like tattoos, likely a form of nanotechnology, along with drugs. Yeah, all that's missing is a luchador mask with that one. Prosthetic limbs, which is a partial replacement of body parts. But for those that decide that it's the best option for them, full body replacement, I mean, he sees two solutions for those that want to do so. Using their organic body parts to finance this by selling them off for huge amounts of money, or to do repetitive tasks with easy to repair or replaceable parts. Yeah. Going part of the way, staggering the cost. I can see why some would do that. Unfortunately, it gave Angela an unpleasant reminder of her past. Quite an assortment of, how can I put it, interesting individuals. And this is just the library getting started. They're likely to be more exotic as things progress. Until next time. Hail the rabbit!